Uh, I now have the pleasure and privilege of inviting Dr. M.S. Sahu, and you can read about his distinguished career in the book bio that you have with you. But I would, of course, like to very much mention that not only has he been a member of the CCI earlier, but he also chaired the very important Competition Law Review Committee, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, and whose report is on the website, which you must read. It's an excellent report. So let me invite our special guest of honor, Dr. M.S. Sahu.
Respected CCI Chairperson Mr. Gupta, distinguished friends on the dais, of the dais, dear competition professionals, my former colleagues from the Competition Commission of India, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to CCI and CII for giving this opportunity to me to speak to you what you already know, and probably you know it better than I do. It's needless to say that competition is important because it benefits consumers in terms of choice, quality and price. It benefits economy in terms of productivity, growth and wealth creation. It also benefits the society in terms of innovation and welfare. In fact, one competes to innovate and one innovates to compete. This competition and innovation are twin drivers of growth in a market economy. Competition allocates resources at the current level, while innovation pushes up the resource allocation at a higher level. Let me just give you one evidence of importance of competition for the economy. One citation, there is one World Economic Forum that comes out with a report called Global Competitiveness Report. While assessing the competitiveness of economies, it classifies economies into 5 classes according to their stages of development. It broadly believes, and that is to a large extent right, that there are 3 broad sources of growth. One is the basic institutions, factors of productions, raw material, all that one needs to do the rudimentary kind of production. Second is efficiency enhancer, competition, and third is the innovation and sophistication. The economies which rely predominantly on the first set of factors, the institutions and factors, typically these have where say 40%, 50% of the income comes from these 2 sources, these factors. Typically these economies have a per capita GNP of less than 2,000 US dollar. At the other extreme, which is in the 5th category, where growth comes, 80% of the growth comes from the competition and innovation, these economies typically have a per capita GNP of not less than 17,000 US dollar. So the level of competition and innovation, that explains much of the distance from $2,000 to $17,000 per capita, and that is what we are here to promote in our economy. Now let me talk about what one needs to compete. The first and foremost, one needs the freedom to compete. Freedom, one can't compete unless, you can't expect someone to compete if its hands and legs are tied up. Freedom unleashes, realizes full potential of every person, every business, every resource in the economy. It's well established that economic freedom and economic performance have a high positive correlation. And if you look at around the world, the countries which generally have very higher level of economic freedom have a better level of economic welfare. And therefore, it has been the endeavor all over the world, all countries, they try to provide the right institutional milieu that provides, promotes, protects economic freedom and regulates freedom only to the extent required to address the market failure and not beyond that. In other words, the endeavor is to have conducive business regulations that make it easier to do business in economy. This is what World Bank calls ease of doing business, to let people to do business, and if many firms do business, then there is competition. So a firm needs freedom broadly at 3 stages of its life: to start a business, what we call freedom of entry; to continue business, the freedom, free and fair competition; and the freedom to discontinue business, freedom to exit. So this enables new firms emerge continuously. They do business as long as they are efficient, and they vacate the space when they are no longer efficient. The first stage ensures the best allocation of resources to the most efficient use. The second stage ensures efficient use of resources already allocated. And third stage ensures release of resources from less efficient use to more efficient uses continuously and seamlessly, and consequently we have the resources work all the time at 100% of the capacity, the most optimum economic well-being. The economic reform typically endeavors to provide freedom at these 3 stages, and let me explain how we have moved in making provision for economic freedom over last 25 years or so. We had constitution which talked about civil liberty and good, well-developed institutions, but we didn't focus much on economic freedom till early 1990s. In the 90s, the focus was on freedom of entry when we dismantled the so-called license permit quota raj. The license was a concept of discretion, except in utilities areas. Today we have completely moved away from license to an entitlement of a registration. There are pre-specified 5-10 criteria. Anybody who meets these criteria is entitled to get that registration or permission to start business, to raise money from through public issues. Everything is all given on the shelf, meet the requirements and do whatever you want, and if the authorities have any reason to deny that registration to you, it has to be by a reasoned order and appellable order. And we had, in sync with this kind of changes, many statutes which restricted the freedom of people. Those were modified in sync with shift from command and control regime to an market regime. We had Import-Export Control Act, Capital Issues Control Act. We had several legislations which carried as a part of its name the word control, and we have jumped those legislations, modified them, moved ahead. Thereby we have expanded the zone of who, what, where, how, when. That zone has expanded, and I just gave you the example. If you want to have freedom of entry, you need the money to start business, you need external capital. If you want disruptive entrepreneurs to come in, it does not happen from the existing firms. So people must have a way to raise money, and SEBI says these are my guidelines. Anybody who meets these 10 guidelines does not need anybody's approval, not even of SEBI. Just give a copy of the prospectus for information. Go and raise as much money as you can, as long as the market is willing to pay, but make truthful, adequate, complete disclosures, and if there is anything wrong in that, you will be hanged. So now meet the requirements. It is an entitlement. We have moved away. I am re-emphasizing that. It is no more this so-called license permit quota raj. To me, license is a very dirty word. So along with the reforms, we moved on to prepare the next level of reforms: liberalization, privatization, globalization. We allowed private players to come in, we allowed global players to come in to enter the market, and that prepared us to move to the next level of freedom, to freedom to continue business. Not that the reforms and freedom of entry stage is completely over, it's a continuous process. As I told, in utility sector, we have not been able to move that far. But reforms is a continuous process. After making substantial progress on freedom of entry, we have now, in the decade beginning 2000, moved to freedom to continue business. When we jumped another law called Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practice Act, which told that size is bad, scale is bad, you need to produce more than 1 lakh metric ton of cement, you need an approval. Next year you want to do 1,10,000, you need another license from me. So we thought that that was coming on our way of economic well-being. So we moved from the regime of control of monopolies of farms to a regime that promoted free and fair competition among farms at marketplace. Size or dominance per se was no longer considered bad, its abuse was, and hence we have section 4 today. All that we did in the decade beginning 90s and the decade beginning 2000, we did two fundamental changes: freedom to start business, freedom to continue business. And this resulted in the index of economic freedom, which measures to what extent the policies and institutions of an economy are supportive of economic freedom, that substantially improved for India since 90s. And the outcome has been astounding. The average growth rate, leaving aside the cyclical fluctuations, if you look at from 92 to 2019 for 27 years, on average has been a rate which is more than double the rate we used to have from 47 to 92, which we used to call Hindu rate of growth. And that is the kind of change this freedom has brought in. And today India is the fastest growing $1 trillion economy. So after having commenced business, after continuing business at a marketplace, a firm may fail to do business, to deliver as planned because of two fundamental reasons I just mentioned earlier: competition and innovation. The firm belongs to an industry where business is no more viable for exogenous reasons, and most prominent among them is the innovation. There can be change in policy, technology, mining. Some source of mine is exhausted now. So in such situations, most firms have economic distress. They are failing and unviable. The only option there is to liquefy, sell the assets of the company in bits and pieces, release the entrepreneur, release the resources for alternate uses. The other situation is that where the entrepreneur, where the firm belongs to an industry where every other firm in industry is doing well, but this firm is not doing well because of its own internal problems. It is not able to compete at marketplace, could be poor organization, inefficient management, and at times there could be some malafide or malfeasance. But most such firms are considered to be in financial distress. That is, these firms are failing but viable and can be rescued if an attempt is made well in time. So it's necessary to rescue these firms well in time from the clutches of the current management and put it in the hands of capable, credible people to avoid the liquidation. Thus, a firm fails mostly on account of competition and innovation. Competition helps efficient firms drive out inefficient firms. Innovation helps new order to drive out old order. Thus, while competition and innovation are important to take us from $2,000 to $17,000, but they carry along with them the germs of failure. The higher the intensity of competition or innovation, higher is the incidence of failure. So in case of failures arising from competition or innovation, the resources at the disposal of the firm is underutilized, management and entrepreneur has failed. Given that the resources are scarce, failures are routine in a dynamic market economy, it was necessary to have a market mechanism. Always we wanted a market solution to a market problem. A farm has failed on account of market problems, and let's enable the market to rescue the farm, liquidate the farm, move away from state or judiciary trying to solve market problems. So allow a market mechanism to rescue a failing but viable farm, liquidate a failing and non-viable farm, and thereby release the resources as well as entrepreneur for competing uses, and thereby provide the freedom to discontinue business, the freedom to exit, the freedom from failure, the ultimate economic freedom. This is what country has done over last 30 years. It has allowed a farm to start business, continue business, discontinue business, all that a farm needs to compete. So now the farms have a complete suite of economic freedom. The next thing they need is an environment of fair marketplace. One can compete if there is a swimming pool, there is a law and order, there is some kind of a sanity. One can't compete in an ocean. So one needs an environment for competition. The first very basic thing is that one needs a rule of law. It seems quite strange why we are talking about a rule of law. You can't be expecting that I do not pay tax and you pay tax and the profit margin is less than the tax amount. So you would obviously not be able to, if the rule of law is such that you are in a position to avoid paying tax, and I am somehow on my own, or I am forced to pay the tax. So there is no way that I can compete with you. So basic thing what we need is, there are many such things which are generally matters of competition policy, not of competition law. Unless you have these things in place, business can't compete. Like the competitive neutrality, you can't have a state enterprise and a private enterprise compete unless you put them. There was under MRTP time, we had state enterprises where outside this jurisdiction of the MRTP, we moved under competition law to put them at the same level playing field. Just now, I think Dr. Ranade talked about the sectoral law. I think Mr. Jacob talked about the sectoral law. So why this competition was put as a general law with a general regulator, and why not with a sectoral regulator? Because it is because that the competition, as I initially mentioned, it is allocating the resources. If you have a different principles in different islands, so you can't have this what we call competitive neutrality. Somebody has a different standards of competition, different parameters of competition, and 10 different sectors have 10 different parameters, then you can't have a global or all India maximization or the best allocation of resources. You will have best allocation in 5 different islands, but not a global allocation. That is why we called, when we talk about, if somebody is trying to disturb this allocation of resources, that is the function of the market. Market alone should decide the price and quantity. That is what we did as a part of reforms I told by giving freedom. We allowed freedom to farms, to business, but market must decide the price and quantity, these two things, and none should be able to control either of these. So if somebody is controlling price or quantity, either through sectoral regulation or through some other means, you are essentially disturbing the free market forces to determine these things. And that means you are misallocating the resources, moving away from allocation, which the market would have done otherwise. And if you create a small disruption at one place, that would mean a ripple effect for the entire economy. If you say that more resources should be diverted by whatever policy you do, should go into, let's say, power plants, that means you are saying that resources will be withdrawn from some other business to this. And then there will be a flow, continuous flow. That's why we say that if somebody is playing with the economy, somebody is disturbing the competition, an enemy of a competition is an enemy of the economy, because he is disturbing the entire system. So that is why the competition law violation rests on the FIR approach, like just file an information, you go to police station, tell that this is my FIR, there is a crime, and it becomes the state's responsibility to address the crime and prevent the further crime. We have moved to a model like that. We have gone to a model where the competition authority is in a position to consider the information. It does not have to be a complaint. And in fact, there is a body I usually quote that is in Brazil, and that is named something like the Administrative Council for Economic Defense. The Competition Authority of Brazil is named as it is an authority for economic defense to defend the economy from the enemies of competition. So the market environment needs so many things: rule of law, competitive neutrality, non-sectoral kind of things. And it must also be easy to do business. Only if the people come in, only if you allow public issues without any hindrance, then you will have disruptive entrepreneurs, market will happen. These are generally the matters of competition policy, competitive neutrality. All these examples I gave you are not as such illegal. These are necessary for competition. These could be competitive, anti-competitive, but these are not illegal. But there are certain things which are illegal, which the competition law prohibits. One has freedom to do business, but his freedom does not extend to an extent that he can come on the way of another person doing the business. When we just talked about the predatory pricing, selling below cost, if somebody has a muscle to sustain it for long, it actually thwarts the freedom of another person who does not have that kind of financial muscle to sell below cost on a sustained basis. So I can take away the freedom of another person by my conduct, but that is illegal. Competition law says that you can't do that. Similarly, one has freedom to do business, but it must do business only. It must try to do better than others, better in terms of price, quantity, market share. It must compete on merit, and if it can't compete, it must get out or must allow it to be thrown out. But it can't try to control either the price or the quantity, which I told, which are the exclusive domain of the market. If 2 people, 3 people, 5 people join hands and try to fix a price, control supply, quantity, anything, that is illegal, what we call Section 3 under the competition law. And these things become more endemic kind of things, because competition pressures in a rudimentary economy, in an unsophisticated market, is not much, because there is a very slow space of creative destruction. But as an economy matures, again sophistication, there is a competitive pressure to somehow retain the market share. When it becomes harder for firms to make profits, there is a greater temptation to resort to Section 3(4) contravention. That requires a vigilant competition authority, an umpire, to keep and watch and ensure that no firm at any time is able to take control over price or quantity. And there are these 3 things: competition law, competition policy, and competition authority. These 3 things are there to address one major problem in the economy. We all talk in economics that the state intervention is required. The state exists, at least in economic matters, only to address market failure. Market failure arises only from 3 reasons. One is information asymmetry, one is externality, and third is market power. This competition authority law and the policy, these are there to address one major problem, that is the abuse of market power, one of the reasons why the state exists. So it's not a small matter why this competition, all this framework is there. They are there to address the market failure arising from the market power. So now so this tells us that competition, when you have freedom, you should be able to kill inefficient firms, but you must not kill efficient firms, and you must not kill a firm by unfair means. And this takes me to the area of law and practice, which is the subject of this roadshow. So as I told you, economic freedom, which is of a very recent vintage, 90s, it's not very absolute kind of thing, it's always in a fluid state. It has many shades of gray, probably because this is encapsulated in economic laws, which is solved by both lawyers and economists, who have an economist has many hands and lawyer has as many hands as the number of clients. So that confuses us. So the determination of a competition issue, when we have moved to something called rule of reason, that requires the appreciation of the context from all legal perspectives, from all economic possible angles. And usually I give an example, and which is very popular among the competition professionals, that there are 4 people who have received a show cause notice from the competition authority, and they are comparing their show cause notice as to what has caused them this predicament. The first one says that he charged a price higher than anybody else was charging. He has been accused of profiteering and exploitation. The second person says that he charged a price lower than anybody else was charging in the market. He has been accused of predatory pricing. Third person says that he charged a price, absolutely zero price. He has been accused of creating entry barriers. And the fourth person says he did not do anything, he just accepted the price that is in the market. He charged the same price as everybody else was charging. He has been accused of cartelization. And there's a fifth guy in Bombay. All of you are familiar with something called liquidity enhancement program of stock exchanges, where you buy a product or service, you will be paid 5 rupees. This is called negative pricing. So this negative pricing is considered good and promoting competition. So these 4 prices, different conducts, high, low, same, zero, different conducts can invite the same outcome under economic laws, and the same conduct may yield different outcome in different contexts. So it is not so much about the conduct as the context. Who, why, when, where, what of the conduct that matters in competition law and generally in economic laws. So let me compare the example with the questions that arise from an imprisonment of civil rights like murder and violation of economic freedom like market abuse, dominant position. So in case of an alleged murder, the first question that faces an investigation is whether the death is natural or unnatural. And medical science answers this question with a reasonable precision. The role of the state is limited only to find out the entire machinery, administrative machinery, courts, advocates, witnesses, all those are there to only settle one issue, that whether the death has been caused by Mr. X, whether X has killed Y beyond all reasonable doubts. So this is very relatively easier to settle as compared to an unfair practice or abuse of dominance position, which means abuse means something unfair. And what is unfair to one may not be unfair to another, and what is unfair in the morning may not be so in the evening. So therefore, the determination of whether a particular conduct is unfair and therefore abuse in a given context becomes difficult, needing considerable technical dexterity. In the earlier case, who killed, who was killed, where was killed, what was the effect of killing, none of these are of all of these are of very little relevance to establish the guilt of murder. But that is why the laws relating to civil liberty prohibit murder irrespective of the context, who, why, when, where, these are not relevant. Even the state can't do it. On the contrary, who abused the position, market position, dominant position is material. Is he dominant? Is he dominant in the relevant market? So therefore, the economic laws allow a greater latitude to business and the authorities than the laws relating to civil liberty, when, as I told you, no one, not even the state, can encroach civil liberty. The state as well as the market participants may encroach economic freedom, but In certain contexts, they may not violate the law. But ascertaining the latitude and using it appropriately requires, again, considerable ability on the part of the professionals and business. Therefore, it is necessary to have institutional capacity within the state, including the regulators and tribunals, among the professionals, among the businessmen, firms, for sustenance of economic freedom. Then only the economy can reap full benefits of having competition law. So we all need to promote the capacity and the entire ecosystem. The other aspect of this is all about the protecting someone from unfair competition, but it is also important to protect somebody from fair competition. Companies we created to live forever, but we do not want them, their life is also as precious as that of life of human beings. We do not want them also to have a premature death. A company, artificial person, own identity independent of stakeholders, but shareholders, they own the shares of the company. No one, not even the shareholders, collectively, individually own a company or any of its properties. Company has no owner and it has no mind of its own. It acts through its stakeholders, and each stakeholder has a unique objective function with a unique set of rights, interests, and level of engagement with the company, and consequently, they try to pull the company in from different directions. The interest of one stakeholder may conflict with that of another, and even may conflict with that of the company. So some of them leave the company at the earliest sign of distress, particularly when you have disintermediate shareholding all across the world. So, and at times the departure of a major shareholders for whatever reason orphans the company. Company, as I told, has indefinite life by law, but there is, however, a continuous threat to its life from the market. Every other company is a predator. A company swallows another company for its own growth, either through hostile or even friendly takeovers. A company takes too much of risk for its survival at times, which becomes its nemesis. It loses business to others on account of competition, and creative destruction often destroys more companies than it creates. The law provides today a process to end the life of a company in certain circumstances. So today the death of a company has become as easy as its birth, thanks to improved ease of doing business. So it is not surprising that today Dr. Ranade was giving the example of these Facebook, Amazon, those kind of things. There is another piece of data which I would like to give to supplement him, is that the average life of S&P 500 companies has reduced from 90 years in 1919, 100 years ago, to 18 years in 2019. Company which was living 90 years, 100 years ago is living today 19. All these companies he mentioned, all of them are born after 90s, probably the oldest of them being Microsoft, 92 or something like that. So all the companies today you see that none of them is more than 25-year-old. So a company having perpetual succession now lives shorter than a human. In 1919, the average life of a human being was 30 years. And today it has become the opposite, 90 years, and in the meantime the company's life has come down from 90 to 19 years. And when we are living 30 years, we created a company which will live beyond us, but now they are dying before us. So what is creating problem is, a company to remain afloat, because as I told, there are so many pulls and pressures pulling it apart. There are so many balances it has to manage. I'll give you only two examples. Two critical balances. One is the big balance between the fundamental concept of limited liability and unlimited liability. The shareholders of a company enjoy limited liability because the society as a whole, because the liability of the company is always unlimited. So the company can create Bhopal gas tragedy, can create Satyam debacle, and who ultimately takes the brunt? It is the society. The company enjoys, the shareholders of the company enjoy limited liability only because the entire society, economy is shouldering the unlimited liability. So a company cannot serve in the long run if you want to benefit one set of stakeholders at another set of stakeholders. Therefore, a variety of institutions, mostly instigated by the law, have come up to balance the interests of various stakeholders, give prominence to the interest of the company over the interest of the stakeholders, and to make the interest of companies subordinate to the interest of society. All that you see, the disclosures, independent directors, regulation of related party transactions, protection of minority interests. There are limitations on the authorities of the various stakeholders, key managerial personnel, auditors, and times, taxes, subsidies, CSR, all these are there. These we call, in a fancy term called corporate governance. It's not that it came up now, it has been there for centuries, but we have given a new term now. And these new kinds of related party transactions, these have come up. These are to address only one big balance, the balance between the limited liability and unlimited liability. The another big balance which the law does not address, which squarely falls on the businessmen and the firms, is the balance between the present and future. A company is expected to serve the posterity with higher and higher prosperity forever. If it lives too much in the present, it compromises its future, and vice versa. It must survive competition and innovation to live longer, to serve the society. It must have strategies for resilience, adaptation, research, development, risk management, leadership, vision, preparedness for unknown unknowns. All these are the things which are not mandated by law. There can be some provision in income tax requiring to invest, to get some tax rebate, you invest in some research and something like that. But the law really does not force the businessman to prepare itself for competition and innovation, survive fair competition. The law balances some other imbalances, but this one is squarely on the businessman. You must have some mechanism. The law provides various layers of security to protect a company, starting with the executive management, board of directors, shareholders. One promising set of shareholders can throw away the existing set of shareholders by a mechanism of takeover in the securities market. Even the insolvency and bankruptcy code says that if the shareholders have not performed, throw them out and bring committee of creditors to rescue the company. Law has so many layers of security, but it is up to the businessman to really defend the company. And just reiterating that, life of a company is very precious. It should not die. There must be an effort, conscious effort, to protect the company from fair competition as well as unfair competition, but by merit, but not by unfair means. So thank you. Thanks for a patient hearing. Thanks again to CCI and CII for giving me this opportunity.
View. So wow, this is really a fantastic exposition. So let's give him one more round of applause, please. I have requested Chairman CCI to make a special effort to actually record this and perhaps not just the text, but maybe even the video. Really a fantastic and quite a tour de force. I can't resist but just pick out a few points before we conclude this session. You know, we began by stars. Sorry?
I must have a chance of rebuttal.
No, rebuttal. I'm not taking any issue with you. I just want to flag what he said. He started off by talking about competition and innovation. So competition needs innovation, innovation needs competition, competition leads to innovation. So this is a very important concept to remember. He also said the importance of not just the law, competition law, its practice and its enforcement, but also competition policy. Actually, many countries like Australia have competition policy, which is at the top, you know, and law is of course an enforcement, but competition policy itself. Then many things I just don't want to repeat, but I was very fascinated by his example, fantastic example of the same act. So if it can be called profiteering, it can be called predatory pricing, it can be called entry barrier, It can be called cartel behavior. And then you said about the liquidity enhancement scheme, because he's been a member of SEBI. So how they give actually, it's negative pricing. So you have positive pricing, predatory pricing, zero pricing, negative pricing. So you can imagine how complicated law enforcement must be, because you have to actually go into the minds of the, it's all about intent and what's in the minds of, divining the minds of the operators. So very, very, very wonderful example you give. He also talked about the distinction between laws like murder, I guess you were talking about murder, and marketplace laws, which of course can be, that's why they need constant relook and amendments and tweaking. But sir, there is something called economic murder also. But so maybe, sometimes when practices lead to economic murder, we should investigate just like the police investigates. No, I'm not talking about predatory pricing. So, and he said we need to protect life sometimes of the company, and the company we should ensure that sometimes it survives. So thank you all. Thank you also for reminding the big switch, low human life expectancy and high company life, commercial life expectancy. Now it's reversed, it's high human life expectancy and very short-lived companies. Anyway, we are always in a new regime. And then he talked about how there are issues which go way beyond what the law is addressing. That is strategies for survival, risk management, becoming resilience, planning for the future, having a longer time horizon rather than short time horizon. So thank you very much, really wonderful, both our speakers. And I should remind all of you that the Chairman Competition Commission, Mr. Gupta, is going to be with us throughout the day. We have 3 excellent technical sessions, one on cartels and agreements, second on merger control, and third on a special sector focus on broadcast and media. Mr. Jacob is here. So there will be enough opportunity for interacting, Q&A, rebuttals and so on. So we are not going to have a Q&A session right now. We will now break for tea and coffee. Very short break, 15 minutes. I want to thank the speakers as well as you, and special thanks to the CCI, because this is it's because of them that we can hold this road show, which is a very important event for us, and even on a Saturday. Thank you all for coming. So let's break for tea and then come back in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Excuse me, sir, ma'am, can you book the holiday?